doesn't.
Now if I turn on polyframes here, and I'll actually switch this material so you can see this better. As you can see, this is divided into two colors, or two polyframes. Now if I look back at my original mesh, you can see where this mask went across, it crossed two polygroups. And so as you can see, the polygrouping is actually being transferred to the fiber mesh. And so what this means is that now I can mask by these polygroups in order to control this hair a little bit better while grooming it. So to do that, if I come over here to the brush palette, which is located right here, it's just docked over here on the side, I can come down to the masking part right here and turn up this mask by polygroups. Now what this is going to do, it's brush dependent, so if I change brushes I'm going to have to set this again. But now I can come and whatever polygroup I start on, it's only going to affect that polygroup. So you can see here I start combing out this type part here and it's not affecting the red polygroup. And then I can start on the red polygroup and you can see it's not touching the blue. So now I have that ability that I can create these parts anywhere I kind of want with this process and get those clean part lines anywhere on the hair for the model. Now in order to set up these parts too, I'll show you how to do that quick. So here we go back to my mesh. I'm just going to clear the mask here. Now this one has some polygroups that I've created for surfacing. So this is basically for sculpturing aspects, so I can open the mouth or isolate the top. So simple things like that, but I need to transfer polygroups into the actual scalp itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to separate this mesh into two polygroups, the scalp and then the face. So I'm just going to isolate this first polygroup by holding Control and Shift and clicking. And then while holding Control and Shift, click again to just expose the bottom part of the face. Now it helps too when you do this actually to be on your lowest subdivision, because this is actually going to give you your cleanest kind of divisions of your polygroups. If you don't have a lowest subdivision, it still works. But if you have a lower subdivision and you set up all these polygroups on your high, when you scroll back down, there may be areas that have inconsistency where your low mesh geometry doesn't relate to the high mesh geometry, and so you may end up with this yellow polygroup here actually popping up here onto this group. So if you have a low resolution base, then it's usually cleaner to set your polygroups up here. So Control Shift on the scalp, and then I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom and go to polygroups and just do a group visible. So now my mesh is set up into two polygroups. Now I can just work on the scalp and not have to worry about the rest of the face. So now I'm simply just going to come and start creating polygroups on this actual mesh for these hair clumps that I want to pull off. Now as you can see, I have the back facing turned on this actual mesh. To do that, you can come to display properties here and turn double on or off. So I usually leave it on during this process, just so when I'm making a group, I don't come in and do that and then affect the stuff behind it. So it's just kind of a clarity thing to make sure I'm only removing the actual pieces I want to do. So I'm going to start blocking this out into little chunks of actual polygroups. So I'm just going to come here and holding Control and Shift and then holding Alt, which will give me this red box. It's actually going to just vanish those polygons right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a group visible. And so what that did was I can just keep going and subtracting like this, and it's a subtractive process instead of an additive one, so it's a little bit faster than generating groups another way. So I'm just going to keep going through this and just grouping visible like this. Now when I get to side areas, and I know I want it kind of even on the sides, I'm actually going to I have symmetry off here, so I'm just going to shoot this through to the other side and then just do a group visible. And what that's going to do is now this polygroup is two groups, but now I can isolate by those and then do an auto group, and now I have it split up into two chunks. So basically when I get to my hair, I want these sides to still contain the same amount of fibers on either side, but I want them different polygroups. So that's just a quick way to kind of do that process. Now I'm going to go through and just kind of scrub through this mesh that actually has this already done. This is using the new undo feature. And so you can just see the process I use to kind of generate these polygroups out. So here's my start mesh, and then I actually went down to the lowest, isolated the two sections, and then started subtracting and grouping visible on all the things to get all these groups kind of established. And so you can see it just goes through. And once you do this a few times, it's extremely fast. You can also set up UV islands and then do group by UVs, and it will set up all these kind of groups for you based on your UV structure. Now, once you go through it, I tend to do this after this, is I'll go through and look for parts that may have colors that are really close to each other. Because when you're sculpting the fibers, I usually turn those polyframes on so I could see how the clumping is actually lining up. And if I have two colors of polygroups that are really close together, it's going to be kind of hard for me to tell if stuff's occluding or running into each other from each of the fibers. And so that's the end process for the grouping. So now I have these groups set up for the hair, and I have the group for the face. So now I just need to create a mask. Now, since I have these polygroups set up, I can mask from these polygroups. So if I hold Control and Shift and isolate the face, and then do it again, I can now just mask all these polygroups that are on the scalp. So now when I come back, I have this already ready to go to use with fiber mesh based on those polygroups I set up. Now if I apply that short wavy hair here again, and I turn on polyframes, well, I actually got to accept it quick. And I turn on polyframes, you see I have all those colors of those polyframes out. Now if I look around the actual edges, you may see areas of color that have bleeded in. So you see I have this color here, but then you see I have these little straggler polygroups that are right here. And they're all the way around kind of the edges of the face. Now why that is happening is because in my grouped version of it, you can see the mask is slightly falling off the scalp grouping onto the face. And so we don't want that to happen. We literally just want the scalp to have these groups and not have any of the polygroup coloring from the actual face. So to get rid of this, it's really simple. I'm going to come down to the masking area here. I'm going to first shrink this mask. So I'm just going to hit that once. And what that does is just recedes the mask back into the scalp area. And then I'm going to do a sharpen mask a few times to kind of sharpen that border edge. And now if I zoom in and look at this now, you can see my mask is on the scalp and it is not bleeding over onto the actual head. So just one little trick to kind of get your masking to kind of be flawless where you have those polygroups set up. And so now I'm going to, if I do the preview here, you'll see I have the hair. And then if I applied that, I wouldn't get any more of those little bleed shapes off of it. Now, a lot of these modifiers you can just play around with. I have one that I've already preset for this model. One nice thing about this, if you find any kind of settings you like, you can save these right here. You can also come back and open existing ones you have. So I'm going to open this one right here. And this is a dark hair one that I have. You can see I have the length set up to pretty high, the max value you can get, which is 2,000. And after you have it combed down and groomed, you can cut the hair to whatever length you want. So I usually max it out to start when doing like long hair pieces. As you also know, I have a texture loaded here. Now with this texture, you may not want the hair to have a texture. You may just want it to be flat color. But if you have the texture here, when you hit this accept button, it's actually going to apply UVs to your hair. So if you don't want UVs to hair, you can get rid of them later. But if you don't have a texture loaded here and you hit accept, you won't be able to get UVs back on those hair splines. So just another little tip is just put a texture on it. You can turn it off later. Now, after you have these settings kind of where you like, you're going to get, basically this kind of view of it. But since you're going to be doing a BPR render, you want to kind of test it some to make sure your stuff's doing how you actually, want it to be. So I do a test at the tips and then at the roots. And so this is just me just coming to BPR and just kind of seeing how this is kind of falling off and making sure I'm not getting any discrepancies between the actual sculpted part of it and the actual tips. And I do this quite a few times while I'm changing settings and make sure I do it before I hit this accept button. And so I'm going to come in and just check this scalp here. And if you want your BPR to render a little bit faster, there's a slider right here. So default it's set to 3. For the purpose for this demo, I usually have it set to 3 and I just let it go at 3. But if you turn it down, as you see now, it's actually going pretty fast when it does the BPR render. So now we have this all set up. It looks pretty good. So we're just going to go ahead and hit accept. And it asks you for this fast preview mode. Some people say don't use it because it doesn't give you an accurate description of your hair. But you can turn it on and off. So it doesn't hurt to have it on. and you can then still turn it off later to see what the hair will look like without it. And I'm just going to remove these temp ones here. Oops. And there we go. And I'm going to subdivide this back up. All right, so now I have my fibers, and you can see it's all pretty colors. Now these are all the polygroups I set up on the actual scalp. Now one thing I like doing is right now it's kind of a mess, a jumbled mess of stuff. So I could come in and start grooming these out all individually, which is great, but I don't really get a feel for the style or the hairstyle I'm actually going for. So I had long hair at one point. I grew it out just to kind of see what it was, and it was kind of a pain to keep up with. But one thing, getting my hair cut or going to professional people to cut hair all the time, they put my hair in rollers before they cut it. And I was like, that's really weird.
Yeah, the same experience.
Yeah. So ZBrush has an option to make kind of digital rollers. So if you come to the groom brushes here.
What, a Hello Kitty rollers?
Could be Hello Kitty
rollers.
rollers.
Yes, I figured.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a groom hairball brush. Now if you're using the brushes too, one thing I highly recommend is if you hit B on your keyboard, it's going to load your brushes. And then you can isolate by the actual name. So for the hairball brush, it's going to be B, then I hit G here, and then I hit H. So my standard brush is BST, and then the hair groom brush is now BGH.
We should plug your digital tutors thing while we're on this.
Yeah, I've got a slide.
Okay. I don't want you to forget. Late in the day.
So now I go through, and I'm just going to hair clump these balls up with this actual brush. So I can just isolate really quick with the Control Shift and just isolate the group, and then you just kind of do the macaroni thing, the spaghetti kind of thing, and just kind of take your brush and move it around, and it's going to actually clump that fiber mesh right up. So I'll go really quick through all these little things and just kind of clump all this hair to kind of put them in digital rollers so that I can actually pull it out later. Now, one thing to note on this is when you do your kind of clumping like this, you want to make sure you start down low around the roots. And what this will do, it's going to pull all those strands kind of toward it. And it's actually just the motion of your brush, so I'm just literally pressing down and just kind of dragging, and you can see it's spinning the actual geo there. And so I just go through and do this hair roller across the entire model. It really doesn't take that long. I mean, you may think, oh, this looks like a long step. I could just start curling it out. But the process in which time saving it, generates me is huge. And if you get kind of like stragglers like this shooting off, oops, you can adjust your brush size larger and then do that, and you'll see it start pulling it in. And so you can start with a large one, and then if you slowly scale your brush size down, oops, it'll actually start making that ball a little smaller. So if you get any of those like straggling pieces, you can get them back. But also, since we're going to be grooming with poly groups, we just kind of want them all balled up. If you have stragglers coming out, when you actually start grooming this, if your stroke is going across the model like that, you're going to grab those stragglers anyway. So it's not a huge deal if they're floating around. So I'm just going to do another one this just as an example. And then I actually have a file that's already in rollers. And we're going to just go this way. And this, again, using the new undo feature that is in ZBrush 4.4. It's a great way to just show the processes and kind of explain how you actually go through and do things. And this one's got a lot of fibers in it, so it's a little bit slower on the undo.
It's like a virtual time machine.
It's true. It is. Back to the 80s, right, Paul?
You better believe it. I'm thinking clown.
I'm thinking clown class right now. Or the Go-Go's is what I'm thinking. Actually, now it just came to me.
And I may have scrubbed back a little bit too far on this.
That's fine.
And so there we go. So now if I scrub through this, you can just see how I just literally doing the same thing. So just taking them, isolating them, and then doing the little macaroni twist with the hair groom brush. And getting all the hair brushed out or grouped up so I can then groom it some more. And we're almost done. These larger clumps, I had to use a larger brush to kind of ball in because they have so much hair on them. Now, the polygroups, you can set them as much detail as you want. If you want finer clumps to do like all sorts of crazy hair, you can do it. You're not limited to the amount of groups for generating hair. I just end up usually working around probably about this amount just because it is a little bit tedious to sculpt all these hair follicles out after a while. So now I'm going to start grooming. So I usually pick the stuff in the lower areas of the hair and then kind of move up across. I want these actual parts to be the last things I actually groom out. So to start this, I usually just grab one at random. I can isolate them, but if I also have this Mask by Polygroups turned on, I don't really have to. And then I'll go and select Groom Hair Long. Now this is the kind of typical brush for hair grooming. I can actually just pull this out here and sculpt across and start getting stuff like this. Now if you notice, when I did this, I'm getting kind of an offset based on how I groom this brush. This is actually controlled in this fiber mesh tab right here. So if I can change this front tolerance collision, it actually will determine how much this is like actually going to adhere to the face or the character I'm sculpting. So I usually set this about 20 when I'm actually doing this stuff. And you can see now it's getting a little bit closer. If that's still not close enough, you can keep just changing this. So it's usually 10 or 20 I go with. And so now you can see when I'm brushing that, it's actually adhering to the character's face rather than being offset. And so with this now, I can isolate this and then start grooming, you know, the hair around the ear and kind of fit it to where it needs to go. And then this hair long brush is good because wherever you start it, it's going to control the end splines. So if I start it here, it's only going to control this bottom part. So it's kind of interesting. So if you get a good starter swoop here, you can then come in and trace the last